Are we starting? Are we ready?
I'm ready when you are.
Perfect. We're on. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar series presented by Observer. My name is Mary Von Owie. I am the editorial director here at Observer. We'll call this a satellite office. Firstly, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Fine Art Shippers, for making this event possible. You can also submit your questions via the Q&A option that you see on your screen. We will answer as many as we can along the way and save some time for questions at the end of our talk as well. So first, before I introduce Mark, a little background on today's event. Observer's annual half-day conference, Business of Art, has been postponed in light of the social distancing measures required to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. In lieu of that in-person gathering, we have offered a series of free webinars. Our aim is to spotlight visionaries in different sectors of the art industry whose experience can benefit arts professionals everywhere during this challenging time. Recordings of past webinars are also available on our website and have covered topics ranging from how galleries and art fairs are moving online to how nonprofits can also navigate the future. But today, we are here to focus on the business implications of the secondary art market. And that's why we are joined by Marc Porter, Chairman, Christie's America. A little bit about Marc. Over his 28 years with Christie's, Marc has worked in a series of roles in specialist and management divisions. In spring 2018, he directed the sale of the Peggy and David Rockefeller collection, which was the largest collection to ever appear at auction, as well as the most valuable collection sold for philanthropic causes. Marc has also been involved with the evolution of the global art business, including online commerce, restitution, private sales. He created Christie's first ever online sales, which is very important right now, on behalf of the estate of Elizabeth Taylor and the estate of Andy Warhol, which have developed into part of Christie's 3 primary sales channels. In his previous role as international head of private sales, Marc led many significant private transactions for artists from Akins to Rembrandt. So welcome, Marc.
Thank you. It's nice to be here and back with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I want to kick things off with reflecting on your keynote from last year's Business of Art event. Because when you delivered the keynote address, the primary market preoccupations were about Brexit and protests in China and Sotheby's going private. So before we dig into the state of the secondary market now, are these other major events from the last year still reverberating into the auction world in addition to COVID-19?
Oh, it's such an interesting question. You know, each one of those things that seems so important to us and were so fundamentally impacting the market have taken second place to COVID, which is impacting absolutely everything we do in every location and in every aspect. So nothing compares to the COVID crisis.
Wow. Well, another area from the pre-pandemic I also wanted to touch on is that back in December, just 4 months ago, the New York Times was speculating about the imminent transfer of substantial wealth from one generation to the next in the next 10 years, the sum of which measures in the trillions of dollars. So in that article you stated, and I quote, I'm going to read it here, at the moment, people aged about 60 are at the peak of their earning capacity, and they are buying post-war art that was collected by their parents' generation. This cycle will change. Can you elaborate on that prediction? Do you still feel the same way?
On which particular aspect? I'm sorry.
That the cycle will change, looking at this transfer of wealth from generation to the next in the art world.
I do believe that as we see in every generation, the newest collectors in the market will buy a generation of artists who are younger, so that we will see more and more collecting in the late 20th and early 21st century field as the markets get up and running again. And certainly we're making plans to address that in terms of how we'll ultimately structure our business.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I have a few questions for you today about predictions for the industry. I kind of want you to tell us the future a little bit. But for now, to get started, before I do that, I'd like to discuss where we're at right now. So Christie's, among others, but significantly Christie's, has moved its auctions to late June. Besides postponing in-person auctions, what strategies can Christie's implement, and what are you implementing to mitigate this disruption?
It's the perfect framework question. And I think that there are three primary answers to that. One is the increasing importance of online transactions, both in terms of the number of sales that we're having. I was just checking before we started. We have 4 times as many scheduled online sales between now and June as we had last year at the same time. So the migration of a great number of sales in almost every single selling area and the area of expertise onto an online format is number one. Number two is the extraordinary resilience and, in fact, growth of the private sale market, albeit with certain issues that have to be addressed in terms of completing those sales on which we're working on solutions. And the third one, of course, the question of what the health of the population and the pandemic will allow in terms of a concept of a live auction, and whether that means exhibition only, exhibition with many people present, exhibition with only one person present, whether there'll be an actual auction room or whether that will be largely, that part of the auction will be largely digital and remote, are all things that we're working on.
Do you have a preference of how you'd want to live stream a type of auction? Would it be in a private space or a little bit larger?
I don't have a preference. Other than to say that the preference has to be what keeps people safe and what creates the best competitive environment for the works of art, and the healthiest transacting platform. I think one of the things that the art market has been grappling with that maybe the financial markets have not is that we don't have an established exchange mechanism. So the New York Stock Exchange can move purely onto an electronic trading platform. We are still at the end of a very long history of gathering in one room in order to exchange things. But as we know, over the last few years, that has become less and less important in terms of the actual end user being present in the room, and the end user either using an agent or being on the telephone or bidding online. And this is accelerating that particular method of completing a transaction. And that's my gut feeling about what we'll see in the future.
Interesting. Well, as I mentioned before, you created Christie's first ever online sales, which is so important now. So now that these in-person services are forbidden and obviously need to be avoided for a host of reasons, how has that prior experience when you were creating the online sales, is that informing your approach right now to adopting these online strategies?
It is very much, in part because one learns lessons from each one of these experiments that you might not have expected. And for me, one of the lessons was how much people trust the person who is hosting the auction, or the gallerist who is having the exhibition, or the advisor who's advising. So it doesn't apply only to auction. I think it applies across the art business, that the reputation and trust in the particular specialist or organization presenting the material actually can replace the requirement to view. I was very surprised. especially during the Elizabeth Taylor sale and then during the Rockefeller sale, although everything was available for viewing, and in that case off-site, almost nobody came to see the things. And what was interesting was that people relied very much on the photographs and the ability to talk with or converse with somebody who knew the property well. So it started to drive my belief that it was the content around each particular object that became so important, rather than the physical viewing. Of course, there are people in there who want to see things, and one of the things that is certainly creating a bit of slowness in part of the market right now is the inability to view and see objects, because so much of seeing a work of art is, so much of loving a work of art is seeing it and experiencing it. But that is being balanced by a content-based approach. And one of the reasons that the digital element is becoming more and more important. And I think for me, that's the greatest learning I had from those online sales.
Mm. Well, I want to pivot quickly to one of the questions that one of our viewers submitted, because I think this really fits into what you're discussing. I love this piece of advice, or this question about what's happening right now. So it says, many nonprofit arts organizations have had to cancel events, and my organization is considering holding an online only auction when we usually have one that corresponds to our spring benefit. So they're asking you, based on trends that you've seen, would you recommend this?
Well, I'm glad that it's a not-for-profit, a person who has a not-for-profit interest who's asking the question, because I do think at the base of this crisis is the damage being wrought on and to not-for-profit organizations. And I think that everybody who's involved in the business of art can and should be doing a lot to help with that, and maybe we can come back to that later. But to answer directly about the online charity auction, we have found that we are staging a lot of them on behalf of organizations large and small, and auctions large and small. We've just announced that we're doing one for AmFAR. I don't know if you know that, but rather than their usual big fundraiser that they have at Cannes, which is the biggest fundraiser of the year for them, we will be having a sale of works of art for them, which will be some combination of online and whatever dynamic digital format we invent by that time in late June. For organizations that have to raise money through these charity auctions, and that's especially important to so many small groups, community schools, non-arts organizations in particular, I think the key to it will be figuring out some way of creating excitement about the involvement in the auction, because so many of those charity auctions that we organize, or that we're charity auctioneers at, require the dynamic in the room of people interacting. So I do think that the people involved in the auction will have to make a special effort to engage and really engage people, because just having it on the Zoom or just having it on WebEx, you will lose some of that energy. And so I think the people in charge of the auction have to do a lot of work in keeping people very much involved.
And speaking of charity auctions, I'm thinking about, how Christie's recently launched a relief auction, an online auction for emergency relief for artists whose livelihood has been impacted by the pandemic. And personally, I think this is so important right now, but I was hoping you can tell us a little bit about how that came about at Christie's.
Sure. Well, Christie's has had a long involvement with the Warhol Foundation for the Arts. And about 10 years ago, the foundation, which is now, I think, the largest artist grant making foundation in the country, every time in times of crisis, the director, Joel Wax, takes the stand that that's not the time to cut back on giving, but the time to give as much as possible. So the Warhol Foundation consigned an additional group of Warhol Polaroids that was sold this week, and sold extremely well, setting great prices for them. And that money's going directly into that. So I think that the model of the Warhol Foundation is, of course, the best artist foundation model in the country, transforming from an exhibiting kind of organization in which they were showing Warhol's work and instead making a large donation to create the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, but then selling the rest of the works of art to create a foundation to give money away every year to the most needy. It was also true after Sandy, because so many artists were damaged. Artist studios were damaged during Sandy, and Joel Wax and the board stepped up to give money then.
It's so great to hear that, Christie's is considering the entire ecosystem of the art world when we, create these programs. I'm really happy to hear that. And, I'd also like to know, how far are you looking into the future? I mean, these strategies that Christie's is developing now, they're taking into account an unknown timeline for when things will return to business as usual. And how sustainable do you think that is?
Well, I think that the question can be addressed in two basic columns. Mm-hmm. One is the current nature of the pandemic and the disease and its contagiousness and its impact, and how long the shutdown itself will last before people can return to some sort of communal living. And history has told us that there is a period of time. We don't know what that is, but that usually has come. The other question, interestingly for me, is that this pandemic has forced us to lean on the tools that we've been building over the past few years in a much more profound way than we would ever have expected. I'm certainly much more adept at using all of the apps and all of the technology and all of the digital resources and assets that I have available to me that when I was going into the office every day, I wasn't using. And I think that it is accelerating the way that we communicate digitally with our clients. Earlier this year, and over the past few years, we've seen the decline in our publishing and the necessity of creating such important catalogs. And I happen to have started in the book department, and I collect books and manuscripts. So I am a great fan of the printed and the written and paper. However, the content that you can create on digital is so rich, and we've seen even our more I don't want to be ageist, so I'll say even our more experienced collectors are very happy engaging with us and using digital material to learn. Certainly that's the case with our Asian buyers, the client base in Asia, but it would be incorrect to think that even the collectors who are in their 60s, 70s, maybe into 80s and 90s, there are some who are super comfortable with it, but fewer. That's something that's definitely changing. The other thing that has changed, and I don't think we really expected certainly we didn't expect the rapidity of it, nor how it would change our view of things so quickly, is the recognition that the number of people attending live auctions has dwindled so dramatically in many, many fields over the years. And we've always had 3 auction rooms. One auction room is used 4 nights a year or 6 nights a year. Another auction room, which is smaller, may be used more frequently. But most transactions are being done electronically. So I think the answer is that it's changed the world dramatically, and certainly needing to be together and needing to be with the works of art is critical to return to normal. But the transactional method, I think, will change forever.
Wow. You know, when you were talking about buyers in Asia, it did remind me of that article in Art News when, you know, it was right after you changed the date of the auction in Hong Kong, and then to later this summer, you were quoted as saying, even in spite of the art market's uncertainty, top clients are viewing the current situation as an opportunity to acquire objects for their collections that have previously have not been available. But could you elaborate on that a little more? Do you think that completely going digitized creates more accessibility?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think that many of our collectors are at home rather than in the office, and collecting does continue to provide a respite from the stresses and the cruelty of what's going on all around us. And I find that our collectors are very, very focused on their collections and adding to and refining their collections because they're thinking about them more. They are as involved as any time that I can remember in what they collect and why they collect and how they collect, and the lessons that they glean from the artists or the authors or the makers that they follow. It's proving to be, as we've always known it, the most human of enterprises in terms of people's collecting and being connected to creativity, and that's continuing unabated. In fact, it's almost the most hopeful thing every day is to see people really exploring where they might go with their collection.
Mm. And, you know, in the same news story, you were also quoted as saying that you feel it's an important indicator going forward that to see the appearance of estates in public auctions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You still feel the same way?
I do feel that. And that's one place that I think there has been a bit of a dislocation in the market. And one element that is, I think, difficult for all of us who are in the business is that because there haven't been live auctions with a big supply of estate property coming on the market because of the restrictions, because of the spread of the virus, and a number of estates have been held off for the autumn, we haven't seen that pricing mechanism establishing prices. We see the prices online for a lot of property, and I imagine that a not insignificant number of estates will move online as that grows and grows. We've certainly seen a lot of private transacting primarily at the very highest end at prices that were set last season, which is interesting, because we are not yet seeing distress selling. We are seeing people who are collectors taking advantage of this time to see whether they might shake something loose from a collector who may or may not have capital needs. That may accelerate. But what has absolutely been put on hold is the sale of significant numbers of estates, and that will return in the fall. And I think that augurs well for a rather large volume of art sales after the summer, and really the sort of release of the pent-up pressure and answering a lot of the questions about where the market is exactly.
That's really interesting, and I want to pivot quickly to one of the questions we have from our readers that also discusses a little bit about the experience of online auctions and how that will be seen from a buyer's perspective here. But They say, as we see more going online, do you anticipate more visual details and more enhanced visual platforms evolving, providing more clarity on the condition of each work?
Absolutely. I believe wholeheartedly that in order to build the online business
Mhm.
and keep people's trust, especially as the price level gets higher and higher and higher and involves objects um, for which there may not be a precise comparable that people can actually go and see. The content, the visual acuity, the three-dimensionality, the color accuracy, the ability to rotate an object, the ability to see an object in scale in your own space or where you might be thinking about it, all of that will become absolutely critical to the digital environment. And that's where, as usual, the younger people that we work with have the best view about it, because that generation that grew up living in a much more video digital world is teaching all of us how to incorporate that into our traditional and tradition bound world. So that will inevitably be part of it.
Well, that makes sense. And I think we need to, I want to pivot a little bit to the future now in our discussion, because I want to hear a few predictions from you still. But before I do that, I don't think the audience, not everyone in the audience might know this, but in the mid-90s, you participated in the economic impact of the arts on New York City and New York State as part of the Department of Cultural Affairs.
Yeah.
That was a huge comprehensive study. So is there anything about your findings from that study that would be beneficial to getting the industry back on its feet now?
Yeah, first of all, I'm putting on my glasses because I think I feel most serious when I have my glasses on.
Same.
The New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, right after Henry Geldsaller left, commissioned a study on the economic impact of the arts in New York City. And after banking and finance, the arts and not-for-profits, the arts for-profit and not-for-profit, have the highest impact on employment and income and tourism in this city. And I believe that it's absolutely critical that we need to get the entire community of artists, visual, performance, everything, together with this administration. Call your city council person. I'm taking a cue from my watching talk show, nighttime talk show at council.nyc.gov. Contact your local city council person. One represents each district, or contact Ana Del Castillo, who's the commissioner for the mayor on arts and entertainment, and make clear that we have to operate as an industry, not as one little gallery, not as one little auction house, but as an entire business of profit and not-for-profit to work together to reopen the city. I checked today, at Christie's, 50 people are members of the union. A lot of the jobs that we have are union jobs. This is not an elitist business that can afford to simply go on for 6 months while the city addresses other issues. 40% of the people who work at Christie's are hourly employees. That is, the impact is so gigantic, and these families and these neighborhoods and our entire ecosystem is suffering so much, and we need to have a voice on the political front as well. So that's, my glasses are off, but that's the most important thing I can say to you.
The glasses are off, the gloves are off. No, but this is really important to discuss. I'm glad you're sharing this because it sounds like people can get involved to help. And you said, so council.nyc.gov, and the contact is Anne Del Castillo.
Well, she runs entertainment and media.
Okay, the commissioner,
that's her particular part. But each person, if you go to that website, there's a drop-down menu, and you can find the council person for your particular neighborhood. I serve on the board of the New York Botanical Gardens, which people think of as a kind of ornamental garden. In fact, and it's our representative, Bronx representative, is actually sick at home with COVID, Richie Torres, and he's a huge supporter of the garden. At the garden, there's something called the Edible Academy. It had been conceived of sort of as a post West Coast farm to table idea. But now we're working on food insecurity in the Bronx and reprogramming for the summer to make sure that we can provide food for people in the neighborhood. Everybody should be in touch with their government leader, thinking how not-for-profits can help in this desperate economic crisis, because all of us in the arts can be leading that, both in our businesses. Yes, we all want to make profit in our business, but also as influencers in the community, we have to get together and do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And once again, it's really encouraging to see you take into account the entire ecosystem within the industry. It's so important. And actually, I also want to point out that earlier this year in January, Observer reported on this, that Christie's is now offering more accessible auctions at lower price points.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that continuing?
Well, I do see that continuing, in that online makes that so easy and is so relatively inexpensive to mount and then sell globally. But the other thing that we're seeing that's very interesting is that the value of objects being sold online continues to rise. Going back to the books and manuscripts field, today we announced that we are selling the first printing of the Star Spangled Banner, and it's a $300,000 object. That's not the kind of object that people would normally think of as an online object, but as clients are becoming more and more used to that format, we're seeing the value proposition, we're seeing the value of objects go up higher and higher and higher. And $500,000, $1 million is no longer seen as unreachable at all. And I think we'll start to see that be rather standard. And at the same time, the middle market and less expensive things can easily go online.
Well, thinking about these objects, it actually segues nicely into another question that was submitted by one of our readers. And they ask, how has the COVID crisis affected the way you source other pre-sale processes? Are lots still being physically brought into the Christie's locations?
That is the single, aside from the human health issue, that is the single most difficult element of figuring out the reopening, especially because we're based in Manhattan, and Manhattan naturally has the most profound and serious restrictions in order to prevent the continued spread of the virus. We have been, but because we're global, we're also seeing other parts of the globe changing. So London, for example, which is another headquarters for us, another nexus of operations for us, is changing the rules, I think this week or next week, about the ability to have a person, to have objects shipped into the warehouse and be seen and photographed. That's not something that we have in New York, but we can do that in Delaware, at the Delaware Free Port, where we can where shipping is considered, shipping and storage is an essential service. So that's starting to change, but I would say that that's the most complex element we have, in part because it also may require, does require, a colleague to actually then physically be in that place, and that is simply too soon given the stage of the virus.
Mm. And actually another reader asked the similar question about maybe it being too soon. They asked, galleries in the EU have been open for a week or two now, with smaller numbers of people allowed inside. Will you still plan to cancel live auctions in person viewing in the US?
I love that question because it goes directly to the kind of debates that we're having in terms of the management of the business. I draw a distinction between what can create a proper viewing and a proper exhibition, and that's something that you can clearly control the number of people who are coming in. And that's true for whether it's private sale or it's true for a public auction. I believe, and in the governor's stages of the 4 stages, the last stage will be the gathering of people for arts and entertainment. So I would think that the gathering of people in an auction room will be the last thing to come back. And that's what we're working on so hard to figure out exactly how to create the content and experience of a competitive bidding process without having it look like one of the president's press conferences.
So what would you say to potential buyers right now looking for guidance on market stability?
I'd say that we've seen extraordinary results in the online sales running at a higher percentage rate than their equivalent live sale 1 year ago. So just this past week, we had a sale called I think it was called the Collector's Sale. It was mid-level English and French furniture, decorative arts, and it sold, I think it was 81% sell-through rate. No inspection, no physical exhibition, great sell-through rate, usual clients and new clients. So we see that the market for that is still fine. And I think that the best advice for collectors and for your art advisors and dealers and everybody who's watching is watch the results of the online sales, and know that private sales are continuing apace. I think that you will find, as it has been for a long time, the people who buy in the primary market have dealers and advisors that they trust implicitly. And many, many people who are with us today will have bought an object from somebody that they trust because that person knows their taste and the buyer trusts them. And that is taking the central position as the most important thing in our business, is that mutual trust between the two sides of the transaction.
I think you touched upon trust, and I think that's also a question on a lot of readers' minds right now. I'm just looking, we've got a fleet of questions that I do want to get to eventually, but I still have some of my own, not to be selfish. But talking about trust reminds me of one of these questions here from a reader that says, will there be a more serious level of accountability for authenticity in the case and higher level of expertise in the actual auctioneers versus the buyers?
I think what that question is going to is, without seeing something, how can you be assured that it is as described? If that's
yes, what I'm seeing here.
and I think that's exactly the right question. People are doing business with people who they know and trust, and organizations that they know and trust, and the market will figure out a way of a mechanism to allow the closing of a deal once the buyer feels assured that representation and warranty has in fact been achieved. So again, it goes to the issue of trust and having the best advisor or purveyor that you can possibly have.
So what do you expect to see more of at these auctions for the rest of the year? I told you I had some future questions. I need more predictions here.
Well, as you asked directly, I think that there will be a lot of estate property that comes to market in the fall. I think that I don't see a categorical shift in terms of what's coming onto the market versus not. I think that's generally, those are such long-term trends. Those aren't year by year trends. And I don't personally have a view as to a category that will be driven to market by virtue of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a fleet of questions from our viewers, and I do want to get to them. I have one more question for you, though, because I know that there are a lot of my fellow journalists tuned in right now. And, you know, for us journalists who are covering the art market, what would you say is an area that we should keep a keen eye on? Like, what should our beat be when we're looking at this entire ecosystem that is frantically running towards innovation to sort of sustain itself in an uncertain industry?
Well, I think that your primary framework of questions about technology is critical. I believe that another question that will, depending on the impact of this and how long it lasts and how damaging it is to the city itself, the question of whether the market returns to New York as a concentrated center or whether it disperses more regionally, in line with the predictions that we're all reading about people moving out of cities into urban, suburban and exurban places. That could inevitably impact New York and all of the major cities of the world, which have been built over the last 30 years from being centers of cultural capital. That's been the driving force in our city. And the best and the brightest and the smartest from all industries go to these first tier cities. And the catastrophe for our business and our city would be the loss of that talent, all wanting to live together and be together and commune together. I believe this is a temporary, believe and pray that this is a temporary situation, and that, as always, people will want to gather in great cities. But that's the other side of it, is a dispersal.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you so much. This is such great insight. So I do want to pivot to a few of these questions that are so fascinating to me. We've got such great ones, and they're all very future focused. So I want to start, one question says, trends will indicate that hip hop has an impact and is a key influence on trends right now, jewelry, etc. Even Jay-Z's most recent album highlights art purchasing in one of his songs. So how will you adapt to the new type of consumer and artists that are influenced by a thought leader within the community?
Yeah, I think that person is not only hipper than I am, but absolutely correct. I think the only way that organizations can take advantage of that and nurture that is to hire people who are of the generation that are connected with that and believe in that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. And we're talking a little more about physical fairs in these next few questions, but one mentions that Swiss art dealer Dominique Levy was recently quoted as saying that the Art Basel online viewing rooms was an interesting experiment that didn't work. So this reader, or this viewer, is asking, does Marc agree with her assessment of online viewing rooms not being a viable solution in the absence of physical fairs?
Well, I hope that we can return to a time when there are physical fairs. I think it's important for our whole community to gather globally. I don't know whether or not they were a failure. Maybe in this first iteration, not as much was sold as possible, but that goes to the issue that you asked about earlier, which was the development of better and better and richer technology around it. First time out, nobody gets it right. You know, you learn by your mistakes, you enrich it, you find out what it is about those virtual viewing rooms that wasn't satisfying, and you try to change it. And I also think that we have to acknowledge to ourselves that we've been in this for 8 weeks. We're at the very beginning of figuring out how this will work, and we're all trying to find our way to a solution.
Mm. And another question from the group, how are you increasing programming to draw in new online buyers during this time when everyone is inside? Are you utilizing or considering any video capabilities to replace in-person viewing for online auctions?
Absolutely. I would say that our marketing and digital content team, as I mentioned to you, a lot of our workers are hourly workers. Their hourly billing has gone up dramatically because they are working so much more in creating content. Because while our art movers and art handlers and preparators don't have the work right now, the digital content team is unbelievably busy creating work, both creating the work that we need to sell what we're selling and also for all of the charity projects that we're working on.
Mm. And I also have a question from Observer's art reporter, our star reporter, Helen Holmes, that I believe you've met and chatted with in the past. And hi, Helen. She also submitted a question and said, I would love to know how the pandemic has changed how Christie's physically ships art.
Well, the answer is that it has stopped, but for a few locations in the world that allow shipping, and those are the Luxembourg Freeport, which never closed, and the Freeport in Delaware, which is open and available for people to use. But it really was a light switch on and off, and the shipping aspect has not reopened, and that's part of the stages of safety as New York State opens. California is, I'm not quite sure where California is. Chicago, I think, begins allowing shipping next week, but that's not shipping into New York, that's shipping within the city. So this regional, our federalist system with strong regional authority is great in terms of protecting us, and part of that protection of us is not allowing shipping yet.
Okay, and it segues somewhat into another viewer question. Christie's has offices and sale rooms in China and Hong Kong that had to close first and are now trying to recover. How helpful has it been for Christie's in the Americas in terms of lessons learned as you navigate the lockdown here?
Yeah, that's such a great question. In fact, Hong Kong is open. Everybody's in the office, and they're planning their sales. We've learned a lot about them in terms of the logistics of managing. It's not exactly logistical, about the lessons about managing a workforce that at one time worked in one small space together very closely and then moved to a work from home kind of atmosphere. And I would say that they have also been enormously supportive on an emotional and sort of guidance sense in terms of helping people feel less discouraged about how long this has gone on. And they've done things like that you would never expect, like boxes of masks have arrived for people here, and the small things that it so interrupted their lives that they knew that we couldn't anticipate, but they knew would be the small elements that make it livable for us, have connected us with them. And that's been one of the most interesting things about this lockdown, has been how much closer relationships have become, both with our colleagues and with so many clients, because people are so in need of connection that people are much more open and everybody's vulnerable, and except for a few completely walled off people, there's the human content and the human contact has been amazing.
Mhm. Well, I'm grateful for this connection today, for sure. Mark, I can't thank you enough for joining us. So this concludes our conversation and all of our questions today. Thank you, viewers, for submitting so much. And if you want to stay informed about the future offerings, you can visit our website, businessofart.observer.com, for more information and a link to register for our newsletter. Do that. And you can join us for our next webinars on May 18th, one for communications professions and a second webinar dedicated to the state of the art market. And you can also, to Mark's earlier point, if you'd like to get involved in helping, you can visit council.nyc.gov to share your voice there as well. Thank you for providing that, Mark. This has been so wonderful. Can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much.
To our viewers, I hope I see you at the next Business of Art on May 18th.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.